I never meant for my parents to find out. It started with one overdue notice I wasn't supposed to see. Then another. Then a quiet decision I made alone at my kitchen table late one night. I told myself I was protecting their pride, protecting my father's identity as the man who always kept the lights on. For months, I paid their bills in secret, until one envelope showed up in my name. The day they confronted me, I realized this was never just about money. It was about dignity, aging, roles shifting in ways none of us were ready to admit, and whether love sometimes means stepping in even when you're not asked. I didn't know that night would be the one I'd replay in my head for months. It was a Tuesday. Nothing special. I had stopped by my parents' house after work, the way I usually did, just to check in, drop off some leftovers, sit at their kitchen table like I had 100 times before. The house still smelled like my mother's coffee and lemon cleaner. Some things never change. We were talking about small things. The neighbor's new fence. A church fundraiser. The weather turning colder earlier than expected. Ordinary conversation. Then my mother said almost casually, "We've just been cutting back a little. No need to run the heat so high yet." She smiled when she said it. That careful smile she uses when she doesn't want anyone worrying. I looked over at the thermostat. It was already chilly in the house, and it was only October. Dad laughed from his chair. "Keeps us tough," he said. "Builds character." But it didn't land like a joke. Later, when Mom asked me to grab her purse from the hallway table, I noticed a stack of mail tucked underneath it. A bright red envelope caught my eye. I didn't mean to pry. I really didn't. But it was half sticking out, and the word "final notice" wasn't exactly subtle. I slid it back the way I found it. I didn't say anything. At dinner, Dad made a comment about keeping the lights on another month. He chuckled again, but this time Mom didn't join in. She just kept buttering her bread, eyes down. My father has always been the steady one. The provider. The man who worked double shifts without complaint. Growing up, I never once heard him say we couldn't afford something. Even when we clearly couldn't. Pride runs deep in him. It always has. When I left that night, Mom hugged me a little longer than usual. She felt smaller somehow. Or maybe that was just my imagination. The drive home felt different. Quieter. The radio was on, but I couldn't tell you what was playing. All I could see was that red envelope, and the way Dad's laugh didn't quite reach his eyes. I tried to reason with myself. They're fine. They've always been fine. Maybe it's just a billing error. Maybe it's nothing. But there was something in Mom's voice. A tightness behind her cheerfulness. When I got home, I stood in my own warm kitchen and turned the thermostat up without thinking. The heat kicked on almost immediately. Reliable. Automatic. I just stood there listening to it. For the first time in my life, it crossed my mind that my parents might not be as steady as they've always seemed. That maybe they were holding something together with more effort than I realized. And that thought didn't leave me. When I think about helping them now, I don't start with the bills. I start with the house I grew up in. It wasn't big. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom that all of us somehow shared without killing each other. The carpet was the same dull beige for as long as I can remember. Dad used to say we'd replace it next year, and next year never quite came. But I never felt poor. Not once. Dad worked at the plant for 32 years. Overtime was just part of life. Saturdays weren't for resting. They were for getting ahead. I remember waking up early and hearing the back door close before sunrise. He never complained. Not in front of us. Mom stretched every dollar like it was elastic. Coupons clipped and sorted. Leftovers turned into something new. Birthdays still had presents, even if I understand now they must have shuffled money around to make that happen. There was pride in that house. Quiet, steady pride. I remember in high school, when a class trip to Washington, D.C. came up. It wasn't cheap. I brought the form home, already prepared to say I didn't need to go. Dad read it once, folded it carefully, and said, "You're going." I told him it was fine. I didn't have to. He looked at me over his glasses and said, If there's something you've earned, you don't step back from it. I went on that trip. Years later, I found out he'd picked up extra shifts that month. They never let us see the strain. That was the rule, even if it was never spoken out loud. Parents protect. Children don't worry. And asking for help? That was something they did for other people. Our neighbor lost his job once, and Dad quietly slipped him grocery money. At church, Mom was the first to organize meal trains. They believed in taking care of others with a kind of stubborn generosity. But themselves? That was different. I can still hear Dad's voice from a conversation years ago. We were talking about retirement, about how things might change. He waved his hand dismissively and said, "I'll never be a burden to my kids. That's not how this works." He didn't say it harshly, just matter of fact, like gravity. And that's what makes this so complicated. Because the man who worked through fevers, who fixed our cars in the driveway instead of paying a mechanic, who made sure the mortgage was paid before anything else, he doesn't see himself as someone who needs help. He sees himself as the one who gives it. So when I think about those red envelopes now, I don't just see unpaid bills. I see the weight that must have settled on his shoulders without him telling anyone. And I realize that whatever I decide to do, it can't just be about money. It has to be about the way they raised me. It was close to midnight when I opened my laptop. The house was quiet. My spouse had already gone to bed. The only light in the room came from the screen in front of me, casting everything in that pale blue glow that makes decisions feel heavier than they already are. I logged into my bank account. I hadn't planned to. I told myself I was just checking balances, being responsible. But really, I was measuring something. How much room did I have? I stared at the numbers longer than I needed to. There was savings. Not extravagant. Not throw money around comfortable. But steady. Careful. Years of being responsible. I pulled up the average cost of utilities in their area. Electricity. Gas. Water. Nothing outrageous on their own. But I knew how quickly those things pile up when income tightens and pride keeps you from adjusting. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. The easier path would have been to call them the next day and say, "Hey, are you guys okay?" I noticed something. But I already knew how that conversation would go. Dad would straighten in his chair. Mom would smile too quickly. They'd insist it was handled. Temporary. A mix-up. I'd be told not to worry. And that would be the end of it. Except it wouldn't. I remembered what Dad said years ago. "I'll never be a burden to my kids." To him, offering help would sound like accusation. Like I decided he couldn't manage his own life. That wasn't what I wanted. I didn't want to expose them. I wanted to protect them. There's a difference. I opened another tab and found the electric company's customer service number. My finger hovered over the phone for a long time before I picked it up. Even dialing felt like crossing a line. When the representative answered the next morning, I waited until I was alone in my car. I kept my voice low. "I'd like to make a payment on an account," I said. I gave them the address. Confirmed the name. My father's name. There was a pause while she pulled it up. "There is a past due balance," she said. I closed my eyes briefly. "I'll take care of it." She asked if I wanted to set up recurring payments. That question lingered longer than it should have. Recurring meant commitment. It meant this wasn't a one-time rescue. It meant stepping quietly into their life in a way they didn't invite. "Yes," I heard myself say. "Let's set that up." When the call ended, I sat there in the driver's seat for a minute, hands resting on the steering wheel. It didn't feel heroic. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt steady, necessary, but also secret. I told myself it was temporary, just until they caught their footing, just until whatever rough patch this was smoothed out. No announcements, no speeches, no awkward gratitude, just lights that stayed on, heat that worked, water that didn't stop. I started the car and drove to work like it was any other day. But it wasn't, because for the first time in my life, I had quietly stepped into my father's role. And he didn't even know it. Once the first payment went through, I told myself I'd feel relief. Instead, I felt alert, hyper-aware. A few days later, I stopped by their house again. Mom was at the stove, stirring something that smelled like onions and garlic. Dad was in his chair, watching the news a little too closely, like the anchor might personally ask him about his retirement plan. Everything looked the same. That was the strange part. No visible crisis. No dramatic change. Just the same kitchen table, the same ticking clock on the wall. Mom mentioned, almost offhand, "You know, that electric notice must have been some mistake. It's all straightened out now." She sounded puzzled, not suspicious. I kept my face neutral. "That's good." Dad grunted. "Told you they mess things up sometimes." He didn't look at me when he said it. I nodded, forcing myself not to over-explain, not to fill the silence with guilt. The gas bill came due the following week. I handled that too. Then the water. I set each one to autopay under my name, routed through my account, careful to avoid anything that would trigger a mailed receipt to their house again. It felt like slipping into the background of their lives. Invisible maintenance. But the more I paid attention, the more I noticed things I hadn't before. The thermostat stayed lower than it used to. Dad wore an extra sweater indoors. Mom started cooking smaller portions, brushing it off as not being as hungry these days. I watched them calculate things in their heads. I recognized that look now, the quiet arithmetic of stretching something thin. One afternoon, I saw a pharmacy bag on the counter with only one prescription inside. I knew there should have been two. When I asked casually, Mom said, "Oh, your father doesn't need the other one right away. We're spacing it out." Spacing it out. That night, I called the pharmacy. I paid the remaining balance and asked them to notify me directly if anything went unpaid in the future. The pharmacist didn't ask questions. He just processed it. Each small action made me feel both steadier and heavier. At home, I started shifting things around in my own budget. We postponed repainting the living room. I canceled a weekend trip we'd been talking about. I didn't frame it as sacrifice, just better timing later. My spouse noticed. "Everything okay?" they asked one evening while we were cleaning up dinner. "Yeah," I said too quickly. "Just being cautious." That wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Back at my parents' house, life continued in its careful rhythm. Dad still insisted on paying for breakfast when we went out. Mom still slipped $20 bills into birthday cards. They believed they were holding their own. And maybe they were, in the ways that mattered most. But behind the scenes, I was stitching up small tears in the fabric. Quietly, methodically. I didn't want gratitude. I wanted them to sleep at night without doing math in the dark. So I kept my place in the background. And I said nothing. The strange thing about secrets is that they don't stay still. They settle into your chest. They sit beside you at dinner. They ride home with you in the car. By the third month, what I was covering had grown beyond utilities. It started small. An insurance premium that was a little higher than expected. A copay that Mom mentioned in passing. I nod, let the conversation move on, then handle it quietly later. But I began noticing more. Dad stopped turning on the porch light at night unless someone was coming over. He'd say it was to save the bulb. Mom began shopping at a discount store 20 minutes farther away because they've got better deals. One afternoon, I overheard them in the kitchen when they didn't know I was within earshot. "We can wait on that refill," Dad said. "It's for your blood pressure," Mom replied softly. "I feel fine." I stood in the hallway longer than I should have. That night, I called the pharmacy again. I paid the full balance and asked them to put the card on file permanently. The technician thanked me like I was doing something generous. It didn't feel generous. It felt like plugging leaks in a boat that wasn't mine but was. At home, the pressure started to show in smaller ways. I stared at our own grocery receipt longer than usual. I hesitated before clicking confirm purchase on things that used to feel routine. We had planned a short vacation that fall. Nothing extravagant. Just a few days away. I canceled it. Work's busy, I told my spouse. Maybe next season. They looked at me carefully. Are we okay? Yeah, I said again. We're okay. And we were. Technically. But there's a difference between being okay and feeling steady. What I hadn't anticipated was the emotional weight of pretending. At Sunday dinners, Dad would talk about managing just fine. He'd say it with that familiar edge of pride, like he was reassuring himself as much as anyone else. Mom once said, "We're so blessed. Things always seem to work out." I swallowed hard when she said that, because I didn't know whether I was honoring their dignity or quietly deceiving them. There's a fine line between protecting someone and taking away their choice. I told myself I was choosing the kinder option, that letting them believe they were managing preserved something essential in my father, his identity, his sense of being the provider. But some nights, lying awake, I wondered if I had crossed into something else. Control. Paternalism. Even pity. I didn't pity them. That wasn't it. I just couldn't stand the thought of them rationing medication or sitting in the cold to prove a point no one was asking them to prove. So, I tightened my own belt a little more. Skipped upgrades. Delayed repairs. Moved money from savings more often than I liked. And every time I pressed submit payment, I felt the same quiet mixture of resolve and unease. I was holding them up. They just didn't know it. By then, the secret had become part of my routine. Log in, check due dates, confirm payments, close the laptop. It was almost mechanical. What wasn't mechanical was sitting across from my father at the kitchen table while he talked about staying independent. There was a firmness in his voice whenever the subject of aging came up, like he was pushing back against something invisible. "I don't ever want you worrying about us," he said one evening, pointing his fork in my direction. "You've got your own family. That's how it should be." I nodded. I know. And I did know. That was the problem. Mom poured more coffee and added gently, "We've always managed. We always will." I studied their faces while they talked. The lines around Dad's eyes had deepened. Mom's hands shook just slightly when she reached for the sugar bowl. They believed what they were saying. Or maybe they needed to. The guilt didn't come in waves. It came in quiet, steady drips. Small moments when I'd almost speak and then stop myself. At dinner, when Dad insisted on paying the check, I let him. When Mom slipped cash into my hand for gas, I laughed and tucked it into my pocket like always. The performance went both ways. At home, my spouse finally asked more directly, "You've been distracted. Is this about your parents?" I hesitated. "It's nothing dramatic," I said carefully. "Just helping out a little." "How much is a little?" That question lingered between us. I gave a number smaller than the real one. Not a complete lie. Just rounded down. Softer. They didn't argue. They just nodded slowly. As long as we're not overextending. That word stuck with me. Overextending. I had drawn lines in my head, limits I wouldn't cross. But those lines shifted each time something new surfaced. An unexpected fee. A higher bill. A pharmacy charge. And through it all, my parents remained unaware. Mom once clasped her hands together and said, "I don't know how we keep landing on our feet." Dad smiled at that. "Because we're careful." I smiled too. But later, driving home, I gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. Was I respecting them by staying silent? Or was I underestimating them by deciding what they could handle emotionally? I told myself that protecting their pride was worth the discomfort. That love sometimes looks like restraint. Still, there were nights when I lay awake and imagined the moment they'd find out. Not because I wanted recognition, but because I wasn't sure how long something this quiet could stay hidden without cracking. It happened in the most ordinary way possible. No dramatic reveal. No shouting. Just a piece of mail. I was at work when my phone rang. Dad's name lit up the screen. He doesn't usually call during the day unless it's practical, car trouble, a question about insurance, something logistical. I answered with a light tone. Hey, Dad. His voice was steady. Too steady. Are you busy? A little. What's up? There was a pause. Paper rustling in the background. We got something in the mail today. From the electric company. My stomach dropped before he said anything else. They addressed it to you, he continued. But it's about our account. Silence stretched between us. I could picture it already. The envelope opened carefully at the kitchen table, Mom standing beside him, both of them reading my name printed where it didn't belong. It looks like you've been making payments, he said. Not accusing. Not loud. Just factual. I swallowed. I can come by after work. Another pause. That would be good. He didn't hang up abruptly. He didn't sigh. That almost made it worse. The drive over felt longer than it ever had. Every red light felt deliberate. I kept rehearsing explanations in my head, logical ones. Calm ones. Nothing dramatic. I wasn't ashamed of what I'd done. But I was aware that I'd crossed into territory they hadn't invited me into. When I pulled into their driveway, the porch light was on. It was still daylight. Dad opened the door before I knocked. Come in, he said quietly. Mom was already seated at the kitchen table. The envelope lay between them. My name was visible through the windowed strip. No one was crying. No one was angry. That almost made it harder. Dad slid the paper toward me. How long? He asked. He wasn't demanding. He was asking like a man trying to understand the shape of something he hadn't seen coming. A few months, I said. Mom looked at me, confusion clouding her face more than hurt. Why didn't you say something? I took a slow breath. I didn't want to embarrass you. Dad's jaw tightened, not in rage, but in something deeper. Pride. Maybe even disappointment. We're not incapable, he said carefully. I know, I replied. That's not what this is. The room felt smaller than usual. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder. Mom touched the edge of the paper with her fingertips. We thought we were managing, she said softly. You are, I said. I just help steady things. Dad leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. Not defensive. Just thinking. For the first time since this began, there were no more background adjustments. No more quiet corrections. Everything was out on the table, and there was no slipping back into invisibility now. The three of us stayed at that kitchen table longer than any of us expected. The envelope remained between us like a fourth presence. Dad didn't raise his voice. That wasn't his way. But there was weight in the way he looked at me. Measured, steady. How long did you think this would go on without us knowing? He asked. I didn't rush to answer. I wasn't trying to hide forever, I said. I just didn't want to make a hard season harder. Mom folded her hands in her lap. A hard season? She repeated gently, like she was testing the words. I nodded. I saw the notices. I heard you talking about spacing out prescriptions. Dad exhaled slowly. Not angry. Just exposed. You went through our things? He asked. No, I said quickly. I saw enough by accident. And then I paid attention. That seemed to land. There's a difference between snooping and noticing. I needed him to understand that. Dad looked down at the statement again. We didn't raise you to take care of us, he said. The words weren't sharp. They were tired. You raised me to take care of family, I replied. Silence followed that. The kind that doesn't demand to be filled. Mom's eyes had softened, but there was something wounded there too. It makes me feel like we failed, she said quietly. Like we couldn't keep it together. That hit deeper than anything Dad had said. You didn't fail, I said, leaning forward. You worked your whole lives. Things change. Prices go up. Retirement isn't what it used to be. Dad's shoulders stiffened slightly at that. Retirement. The word itself carried weight. I can still manage my own house, he said. I know you can, I answered. This isn't about ability. It's about breathing room. He stared at the table for a long moment. I don't want to be your responsibility. You're not, I said. You're my parents. Mom's composure cracked first. Not dramatically. Just a quiet tear she brushed away quickly, as if apologizing for it. We never wanted you worrying, she said. I already was, I admitted. That shifted something in the room. Because that was the truth underneath all of it. Not charity. Not control. Worry. Dad finally looked up at me fully. His expression wasn't angry anymore. It was conflicted. You should have talked to us, he said. You're right, I replied. And I meant it. We sat there, 3 adults trying to renegotiate roles none of us had prepared for. No one stormed out. No one made ultimatums. But the air had changed. The secret was gone. What remained was something more complicated: pride, love, fear, and the uncomfortable realization that time had shifted the ground beneath all of us. And none of us quite knew yet how to stand on it. The silence after that felt heavier than the confrontation itself. Dad stayed seated, elbows on the table, hands clasped together like he was studying a problem he couldn't quite solve. Mom had stopped crying, but her eyes were still red. I realized then that this wasn't really about the electric bill. It was about control, about identity, about the story my father had told himself his entire life. I didn't do this because I think you can't handle things, I said quietly. I did it because I saw you trying to handle too much alone. Dad didn't look up. We were managing. With what? I asked gently. Skipping medication? Keeping the heat low. That landed. He finally met my eyes. There wasn't anger there anymore. There was something closer to weariness. You think I don't know how to budget? He asked. I think you've been budgeting your whole life, I said. And maybe you're tired. Mom let out a shaky breath at that. The truth is, I hadn't planned to say that. But once it was in the room, it couldn't be taken back. Dad leaned back in his chair slowly. Retirement wasn't supposed to look like this, he admitted. It was the first crack. He didn't say it dramatically, just matter of fact. But I could hear the disappointment underneath it. He had worked for decades with a picture in his mind: steady income, manageable expenses, no need to lean on anyone. I ran the numbers, he continued. They worked. On paper. Mom placed her hand over his. Insurance went up, she said softly. Groceries. The house repairs last winter. And I didn't want to start dipping too deep into savings, Dad added. Once that goes, it goes. There it was. Not incompetence. Not recklessness. Fear. I wasn't trying to take over, I said. I just couldn't stand the idea of you choosing between things you shouldn't have to choose between. Mom nodded faintly. We didn't want you to see that part. I'm not a child anymore, I said. You don't have to shield me. Dad gave a small, almost ironic smile. That's hard to turn off. I believed him. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The tension wasn't sharp anymore. It was sad. Honest. I never wanted to be a burden, he said again, quieter this time. You're not, I replied. You carried me for years. This isn't a debt. It's just life moving forward. He looked at me carefully, like he was weighing whether he could accept that framing. I should have told you things were tighter than I expected, he admitted. I just couldn't say it out loud. That was the real breaking point. Not raised voices. Not accusations. Just a father admitting something didn't go according to plan. And in that admission, something shifted between us. Not weakness. Just truth. After Dad said it out loud, I should have told you. The air in the room changed. Not lighter, exactly, but clearer. For months, everything had been built around what wasn't said. Now we were sitting in what was. I don't want you thinking this is charity, I said carefully. That's not what this is. Dad gave a small huff. Sure feels like it. It's not, I replied. It's family shifting. He frowned slightly, like the phrase needed unpacking. You and Mom spent your whole lives making sure I didn't feel financial pressure. You absorbed it. Quietly. I didn't know half of what things cost growing up. That wasn't an accident. Mom smiled faintly at that. That was the goal. And now, I continued, I'm in a position where I can absorb a little pressure for you. That doesn't make you dependent. It makes us connected. Dad ran his thumb along the edge of the table. He wasn't rejecting the idea anymore. He was wrestling with it. I just don't want to lose, he trailed off. Lose what? I asked gently. My footing, he said. My sense that this is still my house. My responsibility. It is, I said immediately. I'm not taking that. I leaned forward slightly. Paying a few bills doesn't mean I'm running your life. It just means the math isn't sitting entirely on your shoulders anymore. Mom nodded slowly. We've always thought of help as something temporary, she said. Like you give it when someone falls down. Maybe help doesn't have to mean someone fell, I replied. Maybe it just means the load got heavier. Dad looked at me for a long time. I could almost see the recalibration happening. All these years, he said quietly, my job was to make sure you didn't worry. I know, I said. And you did that. And now my job is to make sure you don't carry more than you have to. He didn't argue. That felt significant. I should have talked to you, I added, before setting anything up. That part I got wrong. Dad gave a slow nod. Yes, you did. There was no bitterness in it. Just truth. Mom reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. We don't want secrets between us, she said. Neither do I. The conversation shifted then from accusation to logistics. Not dramatically. Just naturally. If we're going to do this, Dad said, we do it in the open. Agreed. He straightened slightly in his chair, some of that familiar steadiness returning. Not defensive this time, just thoughtful. We'll figure out what actually needs adjusting, he said. Together. That word mattered. Together. For the first time since the envelope arrived, it didn't feel like I had stepped into his role. It felt like we were redefining it. A week later, we sat down again at the same kitchen table, but this time with notebooks, statements, and a calculator between us. It felt different. Not tense. Not fragile. Just practical. Dad had laid everything out neatly. Pension income, Social Security, savings accounts, monthly expenses written in his careful handwriting. He's always been methodical. That hadn't changed. I want this clear, he said at the beginning. No guessing. I agree, I replied. Mom poured coffee for all of us like she always did, but there was less strain in her movements. No pretending this time. Just facts on paper. We went line by line. Utilities, insurance, groceries, medication, home maintenance. Nothing extravagant. Nothing reckless. Just the quiet reality of fixed income meeting rising costs. When we reached the bottom of the page, Dad leaned back and exhaled. It's tighter than I thought, he admitted. On paper, it works. In real life, it doesn't leave much margin. Margin. That was the word we'd been circling around for months. I can cover the utilities, I said calmly. Electric, gas, water. We treat it as part of our shared family plan, not a secret transfer. Dad didn't interrupt. And prescriptions, I added. Those shouldn't be negotiable. Mom's eyes softened at that. Dad tapped his finger against the table, thinking. I don't want you draining your savings, he said. I'm not, I answered honestly. We've adjusted things on our end. We're fine. He studied my face like he was looking for signs of strain. You promise you'll tell us if that changes? He asked. Yes. That mattered to him. Knowing the support wasn't one-sided silence. We also talked about boundaries. That word came from my spouse, actually. I'd mentioned the meeting the night before, and they said gently, make sure you're not carrying everything. So I said it aloud at the table. I don't want this to turn into me quietly absorbing every unexpected expense. If something big comes up, we talk first. Dad nodded. Fair. Mom reached over and squeezed his arm. "It feels better like this," she said, not wondering. We agreed that statements would be transparent. No more rerouted mail. No more background autopay without conversation. If I was contributing, it would be acknowledged, not in a way that highlighted it, but in a way that respected it. When we finished, Dad folded the papers neatly. "I still pay for breakfast," he said firmly. I smiled. "Deal." It wasn't about the money at that point. It was about balance. Driving home afterward, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not relief, exactly. Stability. We weren't pretending anymore. We weren't protecting each other from reality. We were sharing it, and that felt stronger than secrecy ever did. It's been several months now. The payments still go through each month, but they don't feel heavy anymore. They feel routine, like another shared responsibility woven into the fabric of our lives. Sunday dinners are lighter, not because the situation changed dramatically. Their income didn't suddenly increase. Prices didn't drop. Life is still life. But the tension is gone. Dad still keeps the thermostat a little lower than I would. Some habits don't disappear. But he doesn't make jokes about keeping the lights on anymore. And Mom doesn't brush off pharmacy refills. We talk about numbers now the way we talk about weather, openly, without drama. A few weeks ago, Dad insisted on taking us out for breakfast. Same diner he's gone to for years. He reached for the check before I could even glance at it. "I've got this," he said, steady as ever. And I let him. Because this was never about taking anything away from him. It was about making sure he didn't feel alone carrying it. Sometimes I catch him studying me differently now. Not as the kid who needed protecting. Not quite as an equal either. Something in between. There's a quiet understanding there. Mom told me recently, while we were washing dishes side by side, I sleep better knowing we're not hiding things. That meant more to me than any thank you could have. I used to think dignity meant independence at all costs. That needing help, even small, practical help, was a crack in the foundation. I don't believe that anymore. Dignity, I've learned, is being honest about where you stand and still standing tall. My parents gave me decades of stability without ever showing me the strain behind it. They absorbed it because that's what they believed love looked like. Now I understand something they didn't teach with words. Love also looks like letting someone stand beside you when the ground shifts. I don't feel like I stepped into my father's role. I feel like we widened it. There's something humbling about watching the people who raised you age, not in a dramatic way, but in the subtle recalibrations of life. Insurance forms, budget lines, conversations that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. But there's also something steadying about it. We're not pretending anymore. We're not protecting each other from reality. We're sharing it. And in that shared space, I've realized something simple. Helping them didn't make them smaller. It made us closer. If you've ever had to help your parents in a way they didn't expect, or struggled with accepting help yourself, I'd really like to hear your experience. Leave a comment and share where you are in that journey. This community is built on honest stories. And sometimes, knowing we're not alone in these quiet transitions makes all the difference.